Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Baby and Them, where we talk about all things birthing and parenting beyond the binary. Today, we have a special guest with us. I'm so grateful that we have Rose here today, who I'm going to let introduce themselves. Hi, Rose. And my
Hi.
name is Laura, and I go by they and she pronouns. And so I'm really excited to throw it over to Rose, who will introduce herself. So Rose, tell us about you. Tell us anything that you want to open up the interview with.
Okay. Thank you, Laura, for having me on your little broadcast here. I really appreciate the platform. My name is Rose, like you said. My pronouns that I go by are she, they. I'm still kind of exploring my identity and finding my place within the gender spectrum. Most of my life, I've identified as a cisgender woman. I still do feel like that label fits me, but also I feel the label of non-binary fits me as well. So still just kind of going with the flow and seeing how I evolve in the process. So I do prefer either she or they pronouns. To be upfront, I am in a cisgender heterosexual relationship, but we have been chosen to be a part of this broadcast, I believe, because of our decisions with our child, which is to use they, them pronouns in public settings for them. And one of the things that we do this for is because we don't want to give them any limiting labels from the start. That's something that's really important to me. We want to let our child grow into their identity, whether that's being cisgender, trans, non-binary, whatever other new categories there are as they age. And so we've chosen to give them a gender neutral name so they can identify however feels right in the future for them.
Thank you for that. And we love that. And that's exactly why we have this platform to really share different perspectives on how parents are going about this approach. And it's really poignant for you to mention that you are in sort of like a cis hetero relationship, because a lot of times people think this is just something for the queer community, but you don't necessarily have to be in the queer community to do this type of parenting, right? But I also do want to make space for you stepping into your non-binary identity, that you are part of this community as well. So
Well, thank you.
it's complex, right? And that's
Absolutely.
the whole point, is that we have more language now. So thank you for sharing that. And you jumped into it a little bit, but can you tell us more about your family dynamic? So who's part of your family? So you mentioned your partner, but how do you identify family, and how do you kind of classify that at this point?
So we are in a typical, what you would call a nuclear family currently, where it's myself and my partner. We have our only child, who's a year and a half old at this point, and our fur baby, I guess you would call it, our cat, who's been with us for many years now. We are really in a lucky situation with our family, though, where we live in a 3-story house where all 3 stories have different units. So below us lives my partner's cousins, who have 4 children. We live in the middle floor, just us. And then on the top floor is my father-in-law. And we're also very fortunate to have across the street, my partner's sister lives there. So my sister-in-law and her 2 children as well. So we are, like I said, the typical kind of nuclear family, 2 parents, 1 child, but we have so much other family nearby to us, which is, we're just really fortunate to have that, especially since we do have an only child. It's just wonderful to have playmates nearby who are cousins, brothers, sisters, however you want to refer to them. We're all just one happy family.
That's amazing. It's so important at this stage to have support around you and to have a community. And so thank you for sharing about your family. I'm wondering, did you always know that you wanted to be a parent? And how did you come to that decision? And, as you came to that decision, how did you decide that non-binary parenting was the right parenting for you?
Good question. Well, to be honest, for my whole life, I've kind of gone back and forth on the idea of becoming a parent. It really scared me, both the idea of childbirth itself, as well as the 2-ish decades of commitment to raising this baby into a happy, healthy, thriving adult. And being kind of an overthinker, that we just really weren't sure if that was in the plans for us. Something that was important to me prior to becoming a parent was waiting until the world was in a place where this kind of gender neutral, non-binary parenting style was commonplace. Unfortunately, or fortunately, life had other plans. And, my ultimate goal was to wait until gender reveal parties stopped or just became less common, until the first question that we were asked when we're pregnant is it a boy or a girl? Where they, them pronouns were common in school, and just where that was the new normal. But, like I said, life has other plans. And instead of being a parent after those changes have come into place, we just see this as an opportunity to be people who help propel that narrative forward. So we're grateful for the experience and looking forward to seeing how the world changes as our baby ages.
Yeah, it's wild that there's so many changes happening in this moment, right? And so many people were kind of coming along on this journey, a lot of pushback, right? And it's kind
Mhm.
of navigating that field and deciding what feels good for your family. And every family does this completely differently, right? So I'm wondering
Right.
what feels good for your family and what challenges have you had along the way? Whether it's, later I'll ask you a little bit more about your birthing journey, but what challenges have you had in terms of maybe institutional, family, education, just what's come up for you in this process?
Right. Right. Well, first I'll handle the kind of first part of your question about, what was the things we were a little more excited about or things that we were looking forward to, which is that, just that this pulled us out of the waiting for the perfect time feeling. It took us out of our heads into our hearts, accepting what life gave us with open arms. It gave me something positive to focus on through the pandemic, pregnancy through all of that was going on in 2020 was pretty wild. But it was just something to look forward to for us. So that was really nice. For your other part of your question of that, the world being on fire in a political sense and via the pandemic, we got pregnant right before the lockdown and we found out shortly after. It definitely did not feel like the ideal time to have a baby, but it was our time. Um, and like I said before, we originally wanted to wait until non-binary parenting was more commonplace, but we're happy to be a part of its normalization. Something that I personally don't believe that things happen for a reason, but I do often believe things kind of work out the way they're supposed to in a less concrete and more along the lines of like a chaos theory, go with the flow kind of a sense. So I don't believe where we've ended up is a mistake. In fact, to quote Bob Ross, there are no mistakes, just happy little accidents. And that's the way that we look at our parenting journey so far. So some challenges that we definitely were concerned over before choosing to have our baby was people not being accepting of our choices to keep their gender private, our family not being accepting, perhaps people not wanting to let their kids play with ours, perhaps them in the future being bullied for not fitting in, especially being an only child, being kind of ostracized for just being in a kind of different place. But mostly so far, our baby's a year and a half old, and mostly it's been fine. We did have two family members who had a little bit of a hard time with the idea while I was pregnant. They had this kind of a fear that our baby would grow up without an identity, which
Mm.
I thought was really interesting way to put it, how much people tie their identities to their genitals for some reason. Of course, the child's going to develop how they're going to develop, and whether that's cisgender, trans, non-binary, wherever they are on the
That
spectrum,
will happen
there's
regardless.
right, yeah. So just some kind of old school ways of thinking that we had to help some family members work through and process, and in the end, that ended up being positive conversations. I'm happy they brought it up, so we were able to talk through it, and mostly we've gotten pretty positive feedback. Public can be hit and miss, when we meet strangers and they ask the question, oh, are they a boy or a girl? But we luckily haven't received much negativity face to face, just a little bit of lack of understanding at
Yeah.
first.
Yeah. And so you kind of clearly laid out all these challenges you've experienced, but how did you prepare in advance? You mentioned a little bit that when you were pregnant, you started having those conversations early on. How did you prepare yourself, your family, if at all? What were those steps?
Good question. So first was getting myself and my partner on the same page. This kind of non-binary flag is one that I'm very passionate about pushing forward, whereas my partner is a little bit more ambivalent as to how important doing things that way versus the traditional way is. So we had to kind of find where our common ground was on what truly is important to us, and how we want to handle certain things before they come up. So for my family, I sent them out a pretty long message just explaining that we're not going to be sharing our child's sex before we have the child, as well as afterwards. We're not going to share it. And though it's atypical, these are our reasons why. Like I mentioned, that did lead to a couple longer conversations with a few family members, while the rest of them just gave 2 thumbs up and said, whatever you want to do, we support and love you, and we look forward to meeting your baby. Um, And we also did share on social media, abbreviated post, but just something along those same veins, just to kind of mentally prepare all of our friends and family for what our choices would be. And mostly we got pretty much positive feedback from everybody. A few people had little questions here and there. Some people mentioned that they were really happy that we were announcing that, because in the future, when they wanted to have children, they always dreamed of doing something similar. So it just really helped us feel secure in our decisions to not go with what's normal and to go with what felt right for us.
Yeah, I hear that and I resonate with it, because a lot of times there is pushback. There's so much beauty and there's so much acceptance and love, but there is some pushback. And when I hear other people say, I really appreciate that you were brave enough, or that you took this step, because that's something that I would like to do, that feels really comforting, to know that we're not alone, because it's not, for me, a choice. It's who we are, it's our values, it's what we believe, right? So to hear other people kind of give warm messages really helps me to know that there's a place for us in this world, right? And that's very welcoming and loving. And so I'm wondering, we've spoken a little bit, about your family, your child, your choices. How was the journey for you with birthing? You can share as much or as little as you like, but I'm wondering how that journey was and how much this parenting factored into your birth plan, and the delivery.
So I'm happy to share just the kind of abbreviated version of our birth journey. It was a 2-day journey that was, a lot of ups and downs, just like most people's deliveries. So my original hope and goal was to have an unmedicated birth. I was prepared for the possible need for a C-section or interventions. When I was born, my family has huge babies. I was 10 pounds. My brother was 11 pounds. So we were both born via
11
cesarean.
pounds.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know. And funnily, my mom, this was back in the 80s, my mom smoked through her pregnancy, which typically will make your baby a little smaller. And even though she did that, who knows what would have happened if she wasn't smoking cigarettes, my God. So we were big babies, and my partner's family historically has smaller babies, 6.5 pounds. So we weren't exactly sure what would happen with us, but so we were prepared for whatever happened. We like to call it as what we had written out was our birth preferences, not our birth plan.
Yeah.
I'm not religious, but I do love the quote that if you ever want to hear God laugh, tell them your plans.
100%, especially with birthing.
Yeah.
Always something else.
Exactly. So we were fortunate that I came into labor naturally. I didn't need to be induced or anything like that. We waited as long as possible to go to the hospital, as is typically recommended if you want to be unmedicated. Just labor as much as at home as you can. When we finally did go to the hospital, got admitted, of course, as dilation was progressing, pain scale was progressing, still wanted to avoid an epidural if possible. One of the things they recommended, which I had never heard of before in all of my research, was saline shots. I don't know if you've ever heard of or used that yourself.
Wow. Yeah, I've
Yes.
never heard of that.
Oh yeah, it was really interesting. It's basically these like 4 or 5 just shots of saline that they put into your lower back, which relieves some of the pressure in a non-medicated way. 2 out of 10 do not recommend. It was actually, getting salt water essentially shot into you is not very comfortable. And it did provide a little bit of relief, but in my opinion, it wasn't worth the actual process of getting the shots. So as my birth progressed, I got up to 8 centimeters. Things were looking great. And then I stalled there for like 10 hours or something like that. So just right on the almost there precipice, but just couldn't quite get there all the way. So at a certain point, my midwife suggested to take the approach of doing Pitocin in the epidural. She said that, she typically does home unmedicated births. And if I were in a situation like that, this would be when she would be suggesting a transfer to the hospital to take this step. So I followed her lead. We ended up doing that. Ended up trying to deliver my baby vaginally. They were unfortunately sunny side up, which, doesn't mean backwards, but just rolled so they're facing forwards. So they're still head down, which makes it a little more difficult for them to fit through the birth canal. So tried pushing for 3 hours. wasn't making any progress. And in fact, all that was happening was their head was getting swollen in my pelvis. So we decided to call it and just go with the C-section. And one thing that was really positive through that experience was the C-section was in my head, this kind of big fear that I had looming over my delivery of like, oh no, I hope we don't go there. But as things progressed and as we finally came to that decision, I was the one who first suggested it. And it ended up being a big moment of relief and happiness. And oh, I finally get to meet my baby. So this thing that was kind of looming over me of fear ended up being a really positive thing in the end. So I'm really grateful to have been able to take that mental shift and see it as a positive versus this like big scary thing when it didn't need to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of times folks are afraid of the C-section or C word because it may seem like it's not your choice, right? Either something
Right.
happens that's medically indicated, or maybe you have people pushing for it and you don't necessarily feel like you're ready for that. But it sounds like thankfully you were in a space where it felt like the right thing for everybody in the room. Everybody agreed. Most importantly, you agreed that it was the right move. Yeah, I'm glad you had that choice and that agency.
Yeah, that was very empowering to, be the one who first suggested it after things weren't progressing versus it being something that was kind of foisted upon me. The
Yeah.
birth team was all very wonderful at being respectful of my preferences, but when things start to go a certain way, you can't force things into what your plan is. You just have to go with the flow.
Yeah, and the priority is that you and baby are safe. So,
Exactly.
and how was the experience in the hospital? Did you have in your preferences anything around gender, or did you kind of just go with the flow?
In the hospital, we just for simplicity allowed for the nurses and the doctors and everybody to use our baby's assigned sex at birth in
Yeah.
terms of their pronouns. And even still to this day, when we go to the doctors, we typically speak in gendered terms there. But in the general public, online especially, those are the places that for us, the non-binary perspective feels more of a priority, just because what we're hoping to do with it is to not let society impose certain gender norms or expectations or standards on our baby just because of their assigned sex at birth. So, in the hospital, they're not really involved in the day-to-day life
Yeah.
with our child. So that's not as important of a place for us to have that distinction. But definitely when we're in public places, online, those are where it's really important to us that we don't allow society to either consciously or unconsciously change the way they interact with our baby just based on their sex.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. And I think, it's so important to allow the child to develop their identity on their own. And, that leads me to sort of my next question. I was noticing that, when I wanted to become a parent and I wanted to parent in a non-binary way, there weren't many resources available. And of course, when I, put into social media non-binary parenting, your page is one of the first that comes up. And so I'm wondering, how did you choose to create that page? And to share the information that you're sharing that we all appreciate. Thank you. So how did you make that choice to create this resource for the community?
Oh, that's a good question, and similar to you, as someone who was making this kind of parenting decision that was a little bit against the norm or against the typical, I looked for resources and didn't really find a lot. When you try to search for non-binary parenting, most of what I found that comes up is parents who are non-binary who are birthing, which, of course, I love having those resources available for people who are in that sort of a situation. But for me at that time, especially when I was pregnant, mostly identifying as a cisgender woman, that particular type of resource wasn't what I was looking for. I was looking for people who are, of any gender identity, trying to raise their child in a more gender neutral or non-binary fashion. And I just didn't find a lot. So I was really shocked when I looked up just on a whim one night when I couldn't sleep if the Instagram handle non-binary parenting was taken, and it wasn't. So I said, hey, why not me? And I decided to, bookmark it. I talked with my partner a lot about the types of things we wanted to share on there. Like, for instance, is it okay to share our child's picture, information on our location, name, all of our sensitive information, making sure we're being safe in the way that we put ourselves out there on the internet, because there are a lot of people who are supportive of this type of parenting style. That's something I was really grateful to see. I was really nervous at first that we would just get a lot of lashback and people sending Bible verses and, people sending a lot of negativity. But really, that's like 1% of the types of messages or comments that we receive, if even that. It's happened maybe 2 or 3 times in all of the time here. So mostly it's been positive, overwhelming. The beautiful community we're building of different people in different ways. Some of the people who are a part of our community are, like I mentioned, people who are non-binary, who have children that they are using gendered pronouns with, people who are in queer families, people who are in cisgender heterosexual families with the typical gendered pronouns, but just want to learn more. So it's just been a really wonderful, diverse following that we've been creating and community we've been creating there. And it's, I'm no expert. I'm not like I don't have my PhD in gender identity or anything. All we're doing is sharing our journey and sharing what we're doing. And if that resonates with people, great. If it doesn't, then feel free not to follow us. It doesn't affect you one way or the other what we're up to. But I just thought that it would be helpful to share what we are doing in case it helps somebody else make a decision that really inside of them is what feels right, versus going with what the traditional or the normal way to go is. Creating a new normal for this next generation is what I'm hoping to do.
Oh, and I can tell you it is so helpful. I especially love the ones where you share what you do and what you don't do. I think that parsing is really helpful. And again, just kind of creating a blueprint, because those of us who are parenting in this fashion, it's kind of new territory, right? For only the past few decades, really. So we're kind of paving a new path. And so it's so helpful to see how other parents are going about it. I can't tell you how helpful your posts have been.
Oh, I appreciate that.
No, seriously, it's really helpful. And I'm sort of curious, what are your values as a parent? Before you started parenting, now, if that's changed, what are your core go-to values that you would say?
Good question. So one thing that's really important to us, if it wasn't already blatantly obvious, is just giving them a space for their identity to take form in an unrestricted fashion. This kind of stems back from when I was a child and my brother was a child. My parents raised us without religion, meaning that they worked really hard to be careful with their language and not impose any of their own religious beliefs. Whenever we had questions, they would always answer, well, some people say this and some people say that. And they were really wanting to be cautious about indoctrinating us into a belief system about the way the world works, just because of what they believe. And I really appreciated that growing up. I didn't really notice it as a child, but as I became a teenager and adult, I really was appreciative that I was able to form my own worldview just based on what felt right to me and what I observed. So I feel almost like I'm kind of taking that a step further with our child, with, of course, still following that same method, but also doing that in a sense with gender, where we're not pushing a certain narrative on gender identity on them. We're not raising them to be cisgender, and then if they change it, we're supportive. We're raising them in a more neutral space and allowing them to discover how they identify going forward. So just giving them the space to take form in whatever way and shape that is as they get older. That's one of our probably my number one most important value for them. Another one for us is fostering independence, making sure that they have the tools to, take care of themselves as they get older and feel strong and confident in their persona. Being so young, the things that we've done so far in that vein is, for instance, baby-led weaning, letting them take control over feeding themselves, giving them choices when possible, whether that be their clothes, the color of the plates or cups they're using, what toy they want to bring in the car, child-led walks, letting them take the lead, letting it go as fast or as slow as they would like to, at their own pace. Sometimes our walks are just opening and closing the front door for a half hour, whatever happens. And also just allowing their physical growth to be a big part of what we do as our activities, letting them climb on their triangle. We had them in gymnastics for a while, and they've just been developing into a very strong, independent little baby. And I look forward to seeing how that develops as they get older. Another value that's really important to us is teaching consent. So of course, again, they're still a little young to really have
consent is so important.
Yes, absolutely. And they're still a little young to have like full-blown conversations about that. But what we've done so far in that vein is we ask them before we pick them up, we ask for hugs and kisses, and we absolutely respect their boundaries and their no's. So, if they don't want to be hugged right now, that's fine. If they don't want to hug grandma or blow them a kiss goodbye, that's fine. So as they age, of course, that will take shape a little bit more, but that is something that as they grow, we're trying to make sure we're implementing that. And lastly, I would say the most important value to us is self-awareness, developing their self-awareness. This is something I could talk about in a whole hour-long talk by itself, but in a nutshell, I was actually a martial arts instructor for about a decade. And I worked with hundreds, maybe even thousands of families over that time, and got these kind of little peepholes into their life, because most of them brought their child into martial arts for a reason. Most of it was confidence, discipline, focus, respect, listening, a lot of different types of life skills that these parents wanted their children to develop better. And over time, over the years, over the hundreds of families that I worked with, I kind of started to mentally peel it back as to what's the root that a lot of these life skills are stemming from. And I found that to be self-awareness. So that's something that I think is really important for the developing child, to just understand where they are in the world, see themselves in their space, and understand that other people, exist, and how we interact with them matters.
I love your sort of kind of structure, and I'm going to maybe take notes of that afterwards and kind of implement it into my own parenting, especially the self-awareness. Consent is really important. Independence is really important. Those are the ones we kind of tend to think about the most, but self-awareness and allowing them to develop their own sense of choices and presence in the world is so valuable.
Right.
Because we really want our kids to be able to eventually leave us and feel secure in who they are and have the skills and the tools to make it in this world. But in order to do that, they need to have a strong sense of who they are.
Right. And, also just how their actions affect the world and affect others. That's definitely a big part of it.
That is a big part of it, because there's so many things, from environmentalism to class, to race, to sex, all of these things that we have to take into account of how we impact others. And so I think that's such a great thing. It's not just about being confident in yourself, but thinking about yourself as a community member, and how you're impacting your surroundings. And I'm wondering, for your parenting and your values, has anything surprised you? Has anything kind of changed your perspective now that you are a parent? Just any kind of unexpected lessons that you might have gotten in parenting.
I mean, there's a lot of lessons when you're a first-time parent, a lot of things you learn as you go along. You can paint this perfect picture of what you imagine it's going to be like, and then you have this tiny little screaming potato that needs your care 24/7.
It's so funny that you say potato, because my wife says the baby looks like a little potato, and I'm like, it's so cute. It is. They do look like bundled like a little potato.
Right. My mom always calls the newborn stage the meatloaf stage, which I think is pretty funny too. But shifting your life focus to needing to care for this little potato, meatloaf baby, whatever you want to call it, 24/7 is definitely a big change that you go through, and you can prepare for it to some degree. But overall, it came somewhat naturally once we got to that point, but it was definitely a big adjustment in the way that our days are structured and our nights are structured, and just how our entire focus of our day changes. From the perspective of non-binary parenting, I was really surprised at how accepting most people are of our choices in that realm. When I did post on social media to our friends about it, I had this whole arsenal prepared of responses of, what if people say this, I'm going to say that. And I had this whole kind of idea ahead of time. I felt like I was so prepared to handle the negativity or pushback, and none of that really happened. People were mostly just 2 thumbs up and said, hey, whatever you want to do. So that was really surprising to me. We do get some little bits of pushback in public, which is what I kind of expected. So I am able to handle those conversations as they come up. But my growth in this way, I think I have had a lot of personal growth in my understanding of different identities, different family dynamics, different parenting styles. Before we ended up getting pregnant, I didn't really have a lot of insight into different family dynamics aside from what I had been raised within. So it was really wonderful creating the account and starting to follow some of these other parents who are on different journeys, seahorse dads, people who are in just all these different types of family situations, and learning more about them, and just finding the beauty in all of these different ways in which we can raise our children, and just getting really excited for the future. that holds, just the new kind of movement that's happening over the last decade or two or three, but it's really starting to become more common and more accepted. And I think that's really beautiful.
It is so beautiful. And, to end on that note, what piece of advice or what kind of beautiful offerings would you give to new parents or people who are considering parenting, particularly in a non-binary fashion? What advice would you give to them?
My biggest piece of advice is probably not to be afraid to do something atypical if it feels right. You're helping to create a new normal for others in the future who maybe are having these same feelings, but might also be a little nervous about their child being accepted or their choices being accepted. So by making the choice to do what is possibly atypical, you're helping to pave the way and helping to create that new normal. Also, just something that I came into realizing that you don't owe anybody an explanation. When somebody asks us now, well, at first, when someone asked if our child was a boy or a girl, I would have this kind of long-winded explanation about our views on gender, and I could see their kind of eyes roll in the back of their head. Whereas now, when someone in public asks, are they a boy or a girl, I'll usually just say, oh, we use they, them pronouns. That kind of answers what the question is. Or gender isn't something we celebrate. Just something short, simple, sweet. Gender isn't something we celebrate is a great way to just explain the why. And saying we use they, them pronouns is a great way to just say the what, because often people are asking because they're not sure which pronouns to use. So that answers the question in a clear way. You don't owe people this paragraph long explanation. You don't need to give them an essay explaining your decisions. Just, short and sweet. You don't owe anybody anything unless they ask. Then of course you can always give more information. Many other parents are doing the same thing right now. We're building a huge web of different family dynamics, and the way of the world is shifting. And so it's just a really exciting time to be a parent and see the way the world will change.
Yeah, I really believe that we're part of this new kind of energy that is on the right side of history. And so here's to paving the way and to creating more opportunities for different families to learn, more resources, more community, more agency, all of that. And thank you for being a part of it. And thank you for taking the time to share today. It means so much to me and to the community watching right now.
So thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I hope you have a great day. And can you tell everybody where they can find you on social media or just any other way you'd like for people to be in contact with you?
Yeah, of course. So far, we just have an Instagram, which is at non-binary parenting. In the future, maybe there will be more social media presence, but currently that's the best place to find me. And my messages are always open. If you ever have a question that or want to share your experience or have a request for a type of post that you'd like to have in the future, like I said, we're just sharing our experience as it develops. So definitely open to having conversations, any questions that I can answer about what we're doing or just making a new friend. So feel free to reach out.
Oh, great. Thanks, Rose. I hope you want to have a wonderful day. Send my best to your family, to your little one, to your partner, and to your community.
Oh, thanks. To yours as well.